everybody, I'm Jay for the Photography Academy and welcome to tonight's Top Talk guest webinar with Tony Bridge. So I believe, Tony, you're with me there?
I am indeed.
So
well, no, I'm not with you. I'm at the other end of the planet.
Well, he is at the other end of the planet. Tony has very, very kindly joined us from New Zealand, and so it's first thing in the morning for him there. It's last thing, well, it's the evening for us here, and we did get our time delay sort of just about got our heads around it about 24 hours ago. So fortunately, it's come together, and we are here talking to each other now. So thank you for joining us tonight. I've already had a sneak peek of what's to come, so I'm sure our audience are going to love what they see and enjoy listening to your thoughts and your feelings about photography and your love of landscapes. Just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're going to tell us more in your presentation, but just before I hand the screen over to you, just tell us a little bit about yourself, Tony, and how you got into this.
I think photography, I've entitled my presentation, which everybody's going to see fairly shortly, a journey, because I think photography is a journey. I've been on it for 30 years and I would like to think I'll do it for another 30. It really began for me when in my last former life as a teacher, when I got sort of shoehorned into teaching photography. One thing led to another. And for the last 8 years or so, I stepped out of a day job, or the safety of a day job, into doing it full time. And that certainly sharpens the mind, if not the wallet. So full time now, but I'll explain more about that in a couple of minutes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, let's not waste any time then, Tony. So because I'm dead eager for everybody. We've got quite a lot of people. They seem to have all joined us now. So just to reiterate that you can feed your questions to me through the question box. If I will feel that I need to ask them at the time, I will interrupt Tony. If not, we'll stockpile them to the end. So please get those through to me. I'm also going to be sharing links to Tony's website and Facebook and all of his information to you via the chat box tonight. But they'll also be able to find that after the webinar on our Facebook page also. So I'm just going to hand you the screen, Tony, and I'll tell you when I can see it, and then you'll be good to go, mate, and it'll be all yours.
Kia ora tātou, everyone. Good evening. Haere mai, welcome from New Zealand. As Jay said, I'm not sure where you all are, but a big welcome from very early morning here in New Zealand. And what I'd like to do over the next 40 minutes is sort of talk a bit about my things I've learned along the way. While I was putting the show together and thinking about what I could do to be of service to all of you, it occurred to me that our photography really is a journey, and wherever we think we're on it, we may think from time to time we're at the end of our journey and gone as far as we can, and that just is just a breathing space before we head off on the next stage and do something else. I'll tell you a wee bit about myself and where I live, if I can get the slide to work. Okay, there we go. For those of you who don't know where New Zealand is, and I'm still surprised that people don't, it's down the bottom of the Pacific. We like to think we're on the top half of the world. And just in case anybody is wondering, we are not a part of Australia. You'll see 3,000 kilometres between us and Australians. And so we are down there, and New Zealand's an interesting country because of its geographic nature. We're right in the middle of the Roaring 40s, so we have a popular song here called Four Seasons in One Day, and you can definitely have them. You wake up in the morning to summer and experience snow and winter during the day. It makes life really exciting for a landscape photographer because you never know quite what you're going to get. A little bit about where I live. And as a landscape photographer, I made the decision a few years ago that I needed to live beyond the city and the landscape. And this is my little village of Hanmer Springs, about 135 kilometres north of Christchurch in the South Island, Te Waiponamu as it's known down here. It's a little village. There's 1,000 people here. On a good day, on a bad day, during the holiday season, it gets to about 5,000. 1,600 homes, and there's only 400 of them occupied. The rest are holiday homes. The village makes its income by being a tourist resort, thermal pools, mountain biking, skiing, fishing, etc. But where I live, up on the hill above the village, I don't have to interact with that too much. And here's a picture of the valley where I live. You can see, taken late in the afternoon, and in case you're wondering where the village is, that's it down there. So this is my abode. It's about 10 to 15 kilometres from where I made this photograph to the other side of the valley. Because I'm a landscape photographer, I spend a lot of time outdoors wherever possible, and the village that I'm in sits at the edge of some pretty wilderness country. So to get out into it is literally a 10-minute drive up the pass. I think I'm very lucky and very fortunate to be able to do that, to be able to drop what I'm doing and just head over the back, as we call it, and make pictures. This is the Unashamed commercial plug page, which I'll leave very shortly. These are some of the sponsors that I work with, and they work with me in various ways. We've built up relationships, and when I talk about what I do in a moment, you'll see where they all factor in. As I said, photography is a journey, and the journey for me has been going on most of my adult life. It began in earnest about 8 years ago when I was faced with the decision as to whether I stayed in my day job as a school teacher or stepped out and did it on my own account. I think many of us think that one day we'd like to do it full time, and maybe we can ease into it. Most professionals in New Zealand, I'm not sure what it's like in the rest of the world, are part-timers, and since the GFC there's an increasing number of professionals in New Zealand who have decided it's all too hard and they've gone off to other occupations. I made the decision that I was going to try and do it in the real world to become a full-time professional, and that, as I said, sharpens the mind. That may not necessarily sharpen the wallet. But I think at some point in your career, if you're passionate enough about it, you're going to be faced with that decision. And I don't see it as a curse. I see it as a blessing, really. It's saying, are you able to man up and do this thing, or are you, do you want to stay safe? And I certainly have found in the 8 years since I went full-time that my own work has progressed substantially. If we make that decision, and I was, sorry, I have to tell you, I was aided in that decision. I just need to share a small story. Years ago, maybe 9 years ago, I ran into a guy who was a professional artist and a very successful one. And he took the time to look at my work, and he said to me, well, Tony, you've gone about as far as you're ever going to go while you have a day job. And I said, what do you mean? He said, while you're part-timing it, that's as far as it's ever going to go. He said, you need to face the fear and do it full-time. Only then will you start to really climb into your own space. And I said to him, well, that's nice for you, thanks very much, that's not going to happen. Mortgage to feed, mouths to pay, and went back to my day job. Within a year or so, that option had come to me, and I had neither the mortgage nor the mouths to pay. So I set off, and this picture here was a significant part of that journey. It's made in the North Island of New Zealand, and when I made it, I stepped even further out and went on a long journey around the world. This is just to give you a sense of what I've done as a professional. I'm not sure about other parts of the world, but certainly in New Zealand, if you can't cover all the bases as a professional, then it's difficult to make a living. I've been a wedding photographer for 20 years. I gave it up 2 years ago. after doing the thick end of 1,000 weddings, I realised that it's just wasn't me anymore, and I need to focus more on what I do want to do, which is the landscape. The bottom row is I shoot editorial as well. I have corporate clients who get me to shoot editorial for them. Portraiture, when I'm approached to do it, and the top right-hand picture is part of a series that I worked on for one of the local Māori tribes in New Zealand. Down the bottom is doing work for books. I've published several books, which I'll talk about shortly, and I also guide and run my own private four-wheel drive off-road trips for photographers. Lately, much of my work has derived from reviewing and blogging and testing equipment for manufacturers. 2 years ago, I got involved with Fujifilm approached me and asked me, I was on my way to spend time in China, and they asked me if I'd like to take their X series with me and talk about it on my blog and online in various forms, and an online magazine I write for, and I said absolutely. So I spent time in China working with the X series camera and making pictures. I said, how do you want me to make those pictures? And they said, make them your way. So this is an example, one night in Hong Kong, and here's another example of the sort of work that I was making. I made the pictures initially for myself, and then supplied them to Fuji. And I think this is very, very important, and it's worth mentioning this at this point, is that as photographers, everybody's a photographer these days. Everybody can use a camera, and everybody thinks they can do it. And when I began my photographic career, I came up through darkroom and film, and it took a long time to master the materials. Film is much harder to master, in my opinion, than digital. And good digital cameras have got so good now that if you can't sort of get on top of the game inside a year, then there's something not quite right going on. However, the world is awash with pictures. I think I read a statistic that said something like 300 to 400 million photographs going on Facebook every single day. And so how do you stand out from the crowd? And that's one of the things I want to sort of focus on tonight. I do not think it is to do with the equipment you're using. I do not think it's to do with having an encyclopedic knowledge of Photoshop, or even being able to copy everybody else. There's a vast amount of very competent work, but to my mind, much of it looks the same, and I think the secret is that the greatest resource that you have is not your phase one kit, it is yourself, and knowing who you are and why you're doing it. And I seriously suggest that the more time you put into that area, the more unique and original your photographs are going to be. I've spent a lot of time on that at my workshops, and one of the initial responses I get is, well, there's nothing special about me. And I say, well, I beg to differ. Every one of us is unique, even though there's goodness knows how many billion of us on the planet. Nobody has ever walked the walk you're walking, nor will they ever do again. It may seem like that, but in fact they haven't. Your actual perception of the world is very, very different. You just need to explore what that is and have the courage to speak with your own voice, to say, this is the way I see it, I'm okay with that. And of course there will be those that disagree. If their criticisms are valid, then that's fine, but don't listen to them too much. Okay, this is again as an example. And so when I was in China, there was the push to do the logical thing, and I thought, no, well, I'm just going to listen to what interests me. And so instead of photographing the ubiquitous oxes and in the paddy fields, I was fascinated by the design and the textures and made the picture according to that. For the last few years, I've been involved in putting together a series of books. This is 3 of them, all of which I think are still available. There was an initial idea that Chris and I had was to do a really silly thing. Let's get a bunch of guys together, get some 4-wheel drives and get off-road and do a book on it. The first book did really well. The publisher loved them. They sold out pretty quickly, and we thought, well, we've done the South Island, why don't we go away and have fun for 3 weeks and do silly boy things, driving up and down impossible hills and making photographs of it and doing books, and that one's also sold out as well. I think that that when you indulge your passion and stop listening to what other people tell you you should be doing, then you're beginning to speak with that singular, unique voice that's you. These days, for those of you who are interested, this is pretty much my life. I went from a single day job where I could predict everything to waking up in the morning and think, which of these will I do now? My income as a professional is I'm never sure from day to day whether I'm a writer, a teacher or a photographer. Comes from doing all these things. I have a small group of personal clients whom I mentor to move their photography to the next level. As a teacher, I've always became very fascinated years ago when I was teaching at one of the local universities teaching photography, that people began to look at the age group of the people that were coming to me. And many of them were coming to photography for really the first time in their lives. When I began to ask them why they were doing it, I realized that for them photography was much about having a dialogue with themselves and getting to know themselves as it was about winning gongs and medals and getting letters and stuff like that. So these are the things I do these days. And that varies from year to year. It's quite an unpredictable life, but it's certainly an exciting one. I thought what I do today is to talk about my own landscape photography and how it kind of clips together. I would say it's been 20 years since I just went out and shot a picture because I could shoot a picture. Because these days my work moves in terms of themes, and it has done themes and motifs, and it has done for that 20 years or so. And so I tend to, when I look at a piece of work, I'm referencing to one of those motifs or themes that are involved in it. And I just wanted to share 2 photographers. I think when we get past mastering our gear, where do we go to? And learning from the masters, studying the great photographers and looking at their work, but more importantly, looking at who they were and why they did it will often help to inform our own journey as photographers. And these are 2 photographers who have seriously influenced me. And the one on the left is Faye Godwin, your great English landscape photographer. And I was lucky 20 years ago to do a workshop with Faye. Her book Land had really got my attention, and when I discovered she was coming out to New Zealand, I signed on to the workshop and went and spent a week learning from her. Faye Godwin taught me a number of things, and I'd like to share a few of those. the first thing she taught me was what I call the 2-cigarette method. And I'd like to just share a quick story about one of my mentors, and I think every photographer needs a mentor at some point. A wise old owl you can go and talk to, who has the wit to listen to your attempts and then gently point you in the right direction. And my mentor was a wonderful New Zealand photographer called Richard Poole. Smoked like a chimney. I realise that's a politically incorrect thing to talk about these days. However, one day we were out photographing, and we were actually on our way to the workshop with Faye Godwin, and we stopped by the edge of a lake, and I jumped out with my gear full of enthusiasm, raced off down to the shore, shot 5 rolls of film, came back, and Dick was still standing there, much as I'd left him, with a cigarette in his hands, staring at the scenery. He got out. I looked at him, and my initial thought was, well, are you going to shoot or what? You know, what are you doing? And then while I was standing there looking at him, he got out his camera, got out his tripod, checked the exposure, made one exposure and put it all away again. I thought, well, that's not much of an effort. When we got to the dark rooms, I busily processed all my stuff to find that most of it was crap. And as I walked outside feeling somewhat dejected, I walked past Dick's dark room, and he was pulling a print out of the wash. And I said, how'd you go? And he just held the print up without saying a word. It was a single exposure, and it was brilliant, serene, stunning landscape. And I went away somewhat chastened, well, a lot chastened. And I thought about it for a long time, and I thought, well, what made the difference? Well, the answer was that Dick had probably smoked 2 cigarettes while he stood there looking at the scenery. And so often, when we make landscape, we run up to the scenery, whip out our gear, blaze away furiously in the hope that we'll get a good one, and then run away, and behind us the landscape is going, well, what was that all about? You have to stop and get to know your subject, and this is one of the things Faye talked about. You have to have patience, and that means turning up well ahead of time and waiting. A thermos of tea can go a long way, or a book or something can help. You have to be willing to wait until things come right, and if they don't, shrug your shoulders and go home, because mastering the landscape is a bit like going into a relationship for the first time. You meet at the party, you stare across the crowded room, your heart stops still, you know it's all on, and you begin the relationship. But it's only when you've been together for any length of time that you begin to truly understand each other, or not, and to begin to get a deeper understanding of the person. And the landscape is like that. One of the things Faye stressed time and time again was when you find a piece of land that talks to you, you must visit it again and again and again, because every time it will be different, and every time it will teach you something new. Rushing around, driving 400 kilometres to make a single, hoping you'll get a great landscape photograph is usually the path to failure. Find one spot and come to know it intensely and personally. The other, and this is the picture I've got here, is one I'd like to share with you. This is a piece of land near Christchurch, and for a long time living in Christchurch, I would watch the storms come up from the south, and I suddenly one day realised that I always looked them in the face. What would happen if I could find a place where I could watch the front approaching from the side? And so I watched and watched for a number of years, and then I came to realise, calculated the times, and when I saw a storm was coming on the weather map, I drove out to this place. It's about an hour's drive or so, stood on the hill and waited for the storm to come. And sure enough, it came in from the left, and I had the time to make a number of exposures of it as it approached. And there was this lovely period between I'd come to realize that, and I'm not sure if you can see the pointer here, that it always started, it came in from the right and out, and there was always a lag before it hit on the left. And so I was able to make these photographs. This was possibly the last exposure I made before the storm actually reached the place where I was standing and began to shake the car, and it was time to get the heck out of it. When I, talking about patience, I was running a workshop last year in the place where I was born, in the Maniototo in Central Otago in the South Island. And we'd got to this particular site, which I've stood on many times over a variety of years. This particular year, we had the heaviest snow in 50 years, and we'd reached the point. We stopped. It was bitterly cold. There was a slight wind blowing, so the wind chill factor was probably about -15. And my class were whinging mercilessly. They were dead keen to get back to our accommodation and wrap themselves around some wine and whiskey and food. And I said, no, wait. So often when we photograph the landscape, the sunset, we point our cameras towards the sun, when in actual fact the greatest beauty is behind us on the opposite side to the sun. And if you wait for the sun to set and then wait possibly another 20 to 30 minutes, the sky becomes quite beautiful. It certainly does down here. And on this particular occasion, we stayed and made this photograph. I made this photograph. The others grumbled and did their best to make photographs. And they said, right, can we go now? And I said, no, we will wait. And they said, oh, come on. And I said, wait, watch the light and see what happens. And we waited another 15 minutes, and the landscape turned to this. As the sun dropped, the sun was well over the horizon to the west. This is looking east. The light and the colours and the tonalities changed remarkably. And then it just lost the light and it went dark. People think that light sort of sinks like in a straight line. In fact, it's a series of little dips and hollows. It dips and then suddenly brightens, then it dips until finally you run out of light. So it's worth thinking, staying till the absolute last minute if you can stay that long. The other photographer who's been a powerful influence on me is Ansel Adams. And about 27 years ago, I came across this famous winter storm clearing Yosemite image. And it stopped me in my tracks. And I looked at it and I thought, whoa, it's a great picture, but it's not exactly difficult to do. All I need to do is get myself over to Yosemite, and I can do one like it. That was then, and this is now, and I've come to realize back then I thought I could do it. These days I'm beginning to wonder. I'm beginning to realize the mastery of this picture. And one of the things that Ansel teaches is the importance of narrative. Whenever we are making photographs, we are telling stories. And the question you have to ask yourself is, are the stories I am telling my stories, or am I just repeating somebody else's stories? And that's a great yardstick. And if you're looking at your own pictures and you're going, yes, they do look like somebody else's stories, because either you need to be the same as somebody else, or you haven't thought about what it is you're truly trying to say, then that's a place to begin. Photography is a journey, and it's as much a journey through the medium as it is a journey through yourself. Ansel taught me the importance of having, if you like, a great work, a body of work that you're continually working on, if you like, a framework around what you're doing that everything is fitting into. Now that framework can change, but if the parts of your work fit in within that great idea that you have, then you're heading in a direction. And within that great work there are your themes, if you like this, the opus, and within it there are your cantos, and I want to share some of those. So I came up with some thoughts here that you could think about, the 4Ks and 2Bs. The first is know what you want to say, know your subject, and know your craft. Faye Godwin taught me about the importance of knowing subject and knowing your craft. Ansel Adams says the way to art is through craft, not around it. And equally, the great Edward Weston says there's nothing worse than the technically brilliant execution of a fuzzy concept. You must know your craft in order to be able to express yourself clearly. The big one in red is know yourself. And the question there is, who am I? If you're unwilling to approach that, then perhaps it's time you began. And finally, the 2Bs. Back yourself because your view is like nobody else's, and break the rules. When somebody tells you you shouldn't be doing this, and I'm probably doing you out of a job here, Jay, when somebody tells you that you shouldn't do something, what you should do is go, well, why not? And if you're irritating like me, you'll go off and explore it until you find your own way of doing things. I like to talk about themes and the themes that exist within my work. I see I've got sort of something like 5 or 6 minutes left. I've talked far too long. And talk about some of those themes and the way that they work together. Now, what I didn't mention was that, like all New Zealanders, we're immigrants of one sort and descended from recently arrived immigrants. I'm a mixture of English, Welsh, Māori and Dutch, and my father's side of the family is where the Māori and Dutch comes from. My mother's family are pure English. And all of us as New Zealanders tend to relate to our ancestry. And so what I want to talk about is 4 themes within my work, and I'll run over those relatively lightly, and then if there's any questions you might want to pop those in towards the end. Now, I came to realize that the things I photograph fall into, if you like, come back to time and time again, fall into 4 categories: land, sky, clouds, trees and water. And for the last few years I've been studying with a number of traditional Māori healers because ideas are what inform the way I look at my own land. Land and landscape are not the same thing. And I've got these under Nuku, which in Māori tradition means it talks about is Mother Earth. Sky and clouds, Tawhiri Mātia. Tawhiri Mātia is the god of the winds, and on one level it's about winds, on another it's about the winds of change in our lives, not the place for it here. Tāne Mahuta is the god of the forest and the land and the things that grow on the land, trees, plants, birds, insects, etc. And Tangaroa is the god of the sea. So I'm going to show you some work based on that, because that is what my work has come to. And the first of all is Papatūānuku. And just in case, just to bring it back to the land, New Zealand, as some of you may know, sits on the Ring of Fire. You'll see that there's a line kind of runs through the island, through here and down there, and that side's the Australian plate, and it's the Pacific plate on the right. So there's really only 3 things that are going to get you in New Zealand: volcanoes, tsunamis, or earthquakes. It's seismically very active in all sorts of ways down here, but it's never boring. Okay. And just to explain a little bit, my mother's family came from the bottom end of the country, from Invercargill, which is very much Anglo-Saxon Protestant sort of homeland, and my father was from the opposite end of the country, which is where the first settlers arrived in New Zealand back in the 1700s. New Zealand's very young historically. When I set out on my own journey to make photographs, what I wanted to do was to master the landscape, and I was doing it with a book project in mind, and I travelled across the country. I was on my own, and as well as sort of discovering things about myself, I was photographing the landscape. I've always been conscious of New Zealand's landscape as being something that is other than purely geological or geographical. It has always seemed to me a very mystical place, and that when I can sit down and close and get out of my own way and listen to the land, it is a mystical and at times very mysterious place. New Zealand filmmakers have long known that. Landscape photographers have taken time to catch up. And so initially I was making pictures like this, and like this one made in southwestland one evening at sunset. I saw the driftwood standing up there on the beach, and it struck me it was a bit like one of those carvings on Easter Island, that there was something mysterious about it. It helped that the moon was up there, and so I made a series of photographs of it. And over the years, one of the things that Ansell's picture had taught me was a desire to master the grand landscape. Grand landscape has been a challenge for me for nearly 30 years. How do you make a coherent narrative from something that has so many disparate elements in it? And I looked at Clearing Winter Storm. I wanted to do my own one, if you like, to create a very complex landscape with a lot of disparate elements that somehow united together. And one day, about 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, I finally made a picture that I felt had in some way come close to it. And this is the Fiordland area of New Zealand, down the bottom left-hand corner, where it's the weather. There is always weather. It's a very sort of Fiordland National Park is utterly beautiful and difficult to photograph. And one day, looking down this valley, the Greg Valley, a storm was retreating. I saw the shot. Now, it required every technique I'd learned in 20 years, because there was a 40-knot wind blowing straight in my face. I needed everything to be pin sharp. I had a vast contrast range, and because the cloud was moving so actively, HDR was out of the question. I had to get it in a single shot. So it involved locking it down on my heaviest tripod, mirror lock-up, cable release, friends hanging round to block the wind, and 6 stops of grad filters added on the front to cope. It took time. However, the picture it did work. Okay, this is another shot of the land. This is the west coast of the South Island, made from a helicopter when I was guiding a private client. And this is, to me, is the mystery of the land that is New Zealand. It's mysterious, and at times it can be almost sort of frightening, and that is my perception of the land, and if you like, my relationship with it, my love for what I see before me. This was made later on the same trip at 6,000 feet. The pilot had showed me how to open the door, so I was able to open the door and stick my feet out on the skids and photograph the valley. Mother Earth in all her mystery. I see the mystery, and I attempt to evoke that through the pictures that I make. And this was made not long ago, a photograph made just a month or two back, and this is a case of waiting, patience. We'd visited the same spot several times over a couple of days. I was working with a friend who's a photographer. This is part of a commission I was working on for a local Māori tribe, and we visited it several times. I couldn't get quite what I wanted, and this particular day the weather came right. There was a combination of an approaching front and a retreating front, and late in the day, and my friend said, "Where are we going?" I said, "We're going back to spot X, because it's going to happen if we wait." And I think time and experience teach you how to look for those things. Also, spending time getting to know the weather patterns in your area is critical, so you can begin to predict what the weather is likely to be like. And this particular day, by visiting it again and again, we finally got what was there. One time was never going to do it. Multiple times are usually what's required. The land does not give up its secrets easily. Okay, so tawhiri mātia. How am I going for time, Jay?
Tony, I'm fine, mate. As long as you're okay, I don't want our audience to miss anything.
Cool.
So yeah, we're good. You're all good.
Okay, so let us continue. This is tawhiri mātia. This was a picture I made when I was I had some time as artist in residence down in the South Island, and I arrived there with a brief. I had 6 months in the flat to live in and 6 months to come up with an exhibition of the district, and I had no idea where to start. It's an area that's largely rural. 96% of its income comes from sheep farming and related industries, and I had no idea how I was going to do it. And then one morning, while I was trying to figure it out, I stepped out and saw the weather beginning to move over the set of hills to the south. And I realized what was going on, that a warm front was combating an approaching cold front, and they were going head to head. Jumped in my truck, ran down to the bottom of the valley, made a series of photographs, and then when I'd done it, I understood what was where I needed to go. And so it led to pictures like this, and I realized that when you photograph the landscape, often you will photograph the land, but in this particular area, the weather affects everything. Standing in a pub one night talking to some of the locals, they were talking about the weather. Now everybody talks about the weather, but these guys were talking about it with great passion and about how a front was coming and they were going to have to move their sheep into shelter because they expected it to snow. And I realized that weather discussions amongst people in this district were critical because it affected their livelihoods and their profit lines, and so when I did that, I realized that the energy lay in the skies, and I found stylistically my horizons dropped to being just above the bottom of the picture, and that led to the whole body of work evolving like that. The voice that I had found was to look at the skies and the way in which they overwhelmed the land. And ever since then, when I go back to that place, which I do annually for a workshop, I find myself interested in the skies. I've come to understand their moods, and so that makes it easier to predict what's likely to happen and to get them to the students to where they need to be. Okay. Another shot just made on the beach, I'm going to skim a little further, is another shot on the beach with some horses. But what made the wild horses in the far north of New Zealand, what I loved was the juxtaposition between the soul-passing cloud and these looking down upon these horses. And that's led to this picture. This is very recent. When you begin to know an area, you get to know its moods. And this image I made a short time ago, maybe a month and a half ago, and because I understood, I've come to get a sense of how the weather works in this particular part of New Zealand, I knew what was likely to happen and where to position myself. Big front coming in from the left, lots of energy. It was blowing a howling storm, and this is why I've come to discover something very valuable about landscape. There are times when the worst possible thing you can do is use a tripod. Hand holding will give you a steadier shot than attempting to lock it down in a high wind on a tripod. Just a thought. Okay. The work, as time has gone by, my work has evolved and become much more painterly, and these days I'm very interested in the work of the early New Zealand painters in New Zealand and their watercolour techniques, and in attempting to produce landscape work, that references that historical tradition of depicting the New Zealand landscape. Tāne Mahuta is the forest. I grew up amongst forests and state forests, and I've always been fascinated by trees. This was an image made for a client. He wanted a photograph of this particular lake. 1 minute after I got there, the weather turned foul and the land and the mirror lake that I've been hoping to get just disappeared. And what I did see was these grasses, however. The client has specific needs and quite a different way of looking at the landscape. And so while I was standing there trying to figure it out, I noticed the grasses moving in the wind into what a lovely juxtaposition between the soft tonality of the sky and these rich grasses. And so the path was easier from there. In snow, sometimes the best pictures can be when the land and when there's no sky and it just becomes quite monochromatic. And the single tree in the snow struck me as kind of trees in winter. Trees in winter with their leaves all gone are just beautiful. One night it was full moon in the same area in central Otago, and this particular tree, a rather sort of wind-battered silver birch, had I looked at it in the moonlight and thought I really want to get this feeling of the silveriness in the moonlight. So this is a 27-minute exposure. It's 27 minutes, and with some light painting with an LED torch from the right-hand side to kind of get that sense. I saw the stars above it and it almost looked like the tree was giving off stars. And this one made recently in the far north. I was really drawn by the textural quality of the trees and the fact that the grey trunks of these coastal trees talks about all sorts of things to do with ancestors and the past. And lastly, breaking the rules, I just wanted to pop this one in. When I stood in front of this tree, I was stunned by its colour. How do you photograph this? You can make a photograph which references the entire landscape. What I noticed was the recession in saturation, if you like, the very bright hue of the tree in the foreground, fading through a softer orange, through green, and ultimately to monochrome. So it's intense colour through to monochrome. That's enough reason to make the picture. The tree was the centre of my attention. It was, if you like, sticking its thumb up. It was right in my face, so I made it in my face in the photograph. And lastly, a few pictures on Tangaroa, who's the god of the sea, which is to do with the ocean, which is to do with water. So here's a few water pictures. This one made in a lagoon. The strange-looking net is used to catch at certain times of the year. We use it to catch a small silvery fish called whitebait. Our whitebait are a little more than a couple of centimetres long. The net sat in the lagoon, and it was a very simple picture to make. It was a question of framing it. I was using a 24mm shift lens, and shift lenses are wonderful for doing bulletproof stitches, and use this to give that sense of the horizon expanding. In this particular place, you have a sense that the world goes on forever. This was made recently on a trip to the South Pacific, to a place called Aitutaki. And again, there's the mystery of this strange island and the cloud hanging over it, and the incredible colour of the water. It really is that colour. I haven't tweaked it at all in Photoshop. And lastly, I think when you take, second to lastly, when you take the time to listen to the landscape, surprises can happen. And I made this one late last year. and it's about 30 minutes up in the mountains from where I live. I stopped and I was looking, and suddenly here's this infinity symbol shaped cloud. No, I didn't do it in Photoshop. It was just there. These things are there, I believe, all the time once we learn to see them. One more water shot, a winter shot. When we find the place, we need to explore it thoroughly. And this is a dam in central Otago. It freezes in winter. And this particular day, there'd been a series of warm winds through, and the ice had begun to crack. And I was there, we were all there actually, it was part of a workshop for maybe 2 or 3 hours. And when you slow yourself down and begin to look at what's beneath your feet, then amazing things can happen. It was a simple crack in the ice, and by using a little post-production, I looked and saw the rocks, and it seemed like things beneath the surface in a way I talked about conscious and subconscious. And you may make of this one what you will, but all I've done is added a little contrast here. There's no clever photoshopping. This is quite a mysterious place in the central North Island called Lake Waikaremoana. And I made a photograph of the waterfalls, and then later I suddenly began to see, when I was looking at it, wondering why I'd made it, I began to notice the faces. So this is called kihua, which is a Maori word for spirits or ghosts. And lastly, the last couple of pictures I'd like to share are some cloud pictures. I have a sub-series I've been working on for a number of years now. They come when they come, and I don't try to force them, called passing elementals. Cloud pictures, in some ways it references Stieglitz's clouds as equivalents from back in the early 1900s. My version of it, I call it passing elementals, and there's been a little post-prod, but the clouds are always there, and it's just a question of being aware of them and making the photographs when those things come. So the dialogue you're having with yourself, and we're nearly at the end there, one more slide to go. Things to think about. Landscape and land are not the same thing, and that's a whole seminar in itself. They are not the same thing. People usually confuse the two, but they are not the same thing at all. And one last thing to think about, when you photograph the land, you're making 3 portraits. You're making a portrait of the land, you're making a portrait of yourself, and you're making a portrait of the space between. You are photographing the dialogue between you and the land. And when you look at your landscape, or what you call your landscape photographs, you may ask yourself, what was the dialogue? What conversation were we having? And it's also something that an old friend and mentor said to me. Remember, Tony, he said, the camera points both ways. Thank you for listening to me. Back to you, Jay.
Tony, thank you so much, and we've had some fantastic response, loving the presentation, and I didn't want to stop you, so thank you for that. I hope you're okay for time, because I do have quite a few questions. I'm happy to ask them if you're happy to stay with us, and I know there's a lot of keen questions that they'd like me to get answered from you.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure and my honour.
We've had a few questions about the equipment. I know you said that you do use the Fuji cameras. What's your main sort of cameras, and do you have a favourite lens?
Oh, okay. Oh, easy ones. You know, my favourite lens is that's a bit sort of, you know, a bit like interchangeable girlfriends, really. I'm basically, most of my landscape is shot either with the X series or the D800. As you can see, Nikon look after me as well. My favourite focal length has to be a 35-1.4, and I'm not sure if you noticed, there was a really wild cloud and lake shot near the end of the presentation where I said don't use a tripod. There are times when you just don't use one. That was shot on a 35mm Sigma art lens. I was test driving. I'm going to write a review on it shortly. The wind was so strong you couldn't stand up, so I kind of huddled in shelter and handheld it. My favourite, time and time again, people think I'm using a 14 or a 20 or something. Time and time again, my favourite focal length is 35. That's 35 full frame equivalent.
Brilliant. I think you've kind of touched on this next question. This question came in quite early, but I think you touched on it a little bit when you were talking about shooting the skies and again away from the land. How important is a horizon in the photograph?
I think if you don't have a horizon, it's a photograph of sky. If you have a horizon or a little bit of land somewhere in the picture, then you've immediately given scale to what you're doing. A little bit of land, those shots where I thought about that. Just a photograph of sky just says I photographed some sky. When you have land underneath it, which is something, a scale factor we recognize, then what you have, you can then look to the sky and it actually magnifies the grandeur of the sky by having the land in it. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think, yeah, nailed it for me there, mate. That's brilliant. Well, I think, again, something else you touched on briefly, but you said you actually didn't have time for. So what is your feeling with HDR photography when shooting landscapes?
I use it. You know, when it steps outside the bounds, I use it quite a lot. I don't have a problem with it. What I do have a problem is cartoon HDR, if you know what I mean. HDR should be used, in my opinion, to the point where it's almost invisible, so that if you're faced with a sunrise where the brightness range is well beyond the sensor, then yes, I would stitch and use HDR, but I'd be trying to bring it back to something that doesn't say, look how sharp I am with HDR. You know, so much of what I see is just horrible, and all it's doing is the photographer saying, look what I can do. It's got nothing to do with the land that's been photographed or a response to the land.
Brilliant, pal. Thanks for that. Okay, this is more of a statement, but there is a question at the end of it. You clearly have some fantastic scenery to work with. This makes a difference to the photography, do you think, or can this be done anywhere? It's just using your eyes.
Oh, I absolutely think using my eyes. I didn't put any of my work in from South Africa, where I spent a bit of time. And I've got some wonderful work I absolutely treasure I made when I was teaching at the University of Southeast Alaska up in Sitka a few years back. There's always gorgeous landscape. It's about your eyes. And yes, I do have the advantage of being in a I guess a little country. They say about New Zealand that when God was test driving geology and landscape, he tried every combo he could think of in New Zealand, and then when he was satisfied, he went off and did it on a bigger scale in different parts of the world. I think while I have this incredible range of landscapes, when I've been travelling overseas, there is always something to photograph. I think it's how you look at it.
Absolutely, in complete agreement with you there. But you are very fortunate, and I do want to come and visit because it's amazing, stunning, and excellent. A couple of questions here on the same theme. You mentioned in your presentation that you're using filters. How often do you use filters, and what types do you use?
Okay, I just got asked that question yesterday. Basically, my filter supply is pretty limited. I use I've got an ND when I'm ND 8. I occasionally use a polarizer. I'll use grads when I want to cool the sky down, but that's about it really. That's about all I use.
Great. I've got two questions about one of the photographs you talked about, which was actually your 27-minute exposure when you were painting the light. So I just asked the first one to start with. So it's just a bit, let's make sure I get it right. Just what a fantastic tree light painting shot. What made you shoot it for 27 minutes, and how did you get the exposure time in your head? Oh, it's the same question actually. Two people have asked exactly the same question. There you go.
Oh, excellent. Well, of course, a 27-minute exposure is a 54-minute exposure because you have to turn on dark frame subtraction. A bit of by guess and by God. I looked at it and thought, ooh, what do I think on this one? I mean, it was really dark, and you can see that from the movement of the stars in the back of the shot. I thought, I've done it before, so I thought I need the painting, I need to get the, if you like, the shadows where I want them. So I started with 10 and then waited another 10 minutes and then checked it. So you can see I started about 9:30 at night, I went to bed about 1, and I only made 6 exposures. And then I looked at the histogram and said, no, that's too light, let's double it. So I doubled it, and that got up to about 20 minutes, and I thought, yeah, that could work. I did have somebody to help me with it, you know, with the shutter and stuff. And then, so I gave it another, I thought, I'll give it 7 minutes. I know this is by guess and by God, but you're in unknown territory. And then, while my assistant was looking after the camera, I shot it around the side and used the LED torch to paint it. And again, that was just instinct. I shot it in RAW, by the way, on an Alpha 900.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks for that.
I think you just got to give it your best shot.
Brilliant. Okay, that's that one's there. Where am I? You mentioned earlier about the shift lens and how you found it helped with your stitching. Can you elaborate on that a bit for us?
Sure. I mean, one of the issues with using, especially wide angle, and just moving it on the camera, you know, rotating it about the center of the camera, you change the center of focus, if you like. You've got to be exactly over the focal point. With the shift lens, what happens is the camera stays steady, but the lens moves relative to the lens axis, and so you get everything, if you like, in the same plane. I'm just about to write some reviews for my blog, which I'll do in the next couple of weeks. Over Christmas, I spent time using a tilt and shift, testing tilt and shifts for Nikon. And I have to say it's very, very easy, because all you do is you set up the camera, check your framing by moving it left and right, and then lock the tripod down, do everything manually, manual focus, manual exposure, and try and match the histograms where you can, but usually in the middle is best, and then dial it out to the left, click, dial it out to the right, click. And then the next thing I do is I put my hand in the way for a third shot. It doesn't matter if it's in focus or not. It's really just like a marker to separate the two exposures. And then stitching becomes an absolute breeze, and something like auto pano really just makes it just absolutely breathlessly simple, because it's the same. And you maintain the plane of focus by shifting the lens. Now, it's not only good for that stitching thing, but if you've got one where tilt and shift are on the same axis, if you like, then you can increase your depth of field and stitch left to right as well as increasing the depth of field. I think the shift lens is much underrated. People don't tend to think of it for architecture, but actually it's a brilliant tool for a landscape photographer.
Oh, that's brilliant, pal. That's great. Okay, I've got something we're going to talk about post-processing in a moment. I know we're going to touch on that in a minute. So I always get this question: Do you have one favorite piece of kit?
Oh. One favorite piece of kit that I couldn't live without. This is going to sound kind of weird, but it's my vehicle. I've got a double cab four-wheel drive ute. I know you want to talk about photographic kit, but I couldn't get anywhere without that setup truck. Photographic kit at the moment, and that does change. At the moment, you mean cold dead fingers? You've got to break my
Yeah.
move it from my cold dead fingers, Charlton Heston moment. Look, I've just been test driving the new Fujifilm X-T1, and I'm struggling to give that camera back. It is
Excellent.
It's just the best camera I've used in ages. It's just mind-boggling.
Don't give it back. Keep it. Absolutely keep it. Okay. Before we talk about post-processing, I've just got one questions just come in. The picture that we talked about that you shot in the South Pacific, and I think he's talking about the one that was the island with the big expanse of water around it. Very really strong in color. How stringent are you with your color balancing, or was that done? Was that in camera, or was there a bit of post-processing on that?
That picture I made, I set the camera on daylight, and that gets into a whole can of worms, really. Every sensor is going to render the hues in front of it differently. Canons are really big on red and red and yellow. Nikons tend to favour sort of greens, blues, and the Fuji it really gives rich blues and greens, as it did back in the day of film. I have this question asked of me a lot: is that the way it was? And my answer to that is that's the way I saw it. Now, you're not going to see it in the same way because your eyes are different, your life experience is different, and so I actually don't give a piece of fecal matter. That is what I saw, and my aim is to render the image as I saw it. So white balance, yeah, I did touch the white balance just to check the cloud, but and tweaked it to the clouds just to check. But that's the way the blues really are. When you go there, you realise it.
Brilliant, pal. Here's a question that I have that you kind of posed towards me that you'd like us to talk about tonight. How important is post-production in modern photography?
I think it's absolutely critical. Back in I'm just helping a student make the big switch. Yeah, they're still around from film to digital, working with them and talking them into it. Back in the day with film, you shot your picture in camera and you gave it to the lab, and that was pretty much it. Now we are the dark room. We have to be. I think it's very important. It is the creative tool. We can go so far in camera, we have to get perfect framing and a perfect capture as best we can. It's in post-production where we can realize our vision. They really do. And post-production now offers us the ability to manipulate a single pixel in a way that we see. And it's interesting you brought it up with that picture there that we've got on the screen in front of us. That is how I saw it. The actual raw file, if I were to show you, is a bit dull and flat, but I know that the D800 does that. It gives you such an extraordinary tonal range that the pictures look dull, flat, and horrible. So one of the tips that I would suggest to people is use your back screen, your LCD. Your LCD will show you the picture as if it was a JPEG. It's not showing you the raw file, it's showing you a JPEG version. And if you use an EVF, that is what you're seeing. You're seeing it according to the settings you've selected, as if you were shooting JPEGs. I only shoot RAW for serious work. And so often that JPEG rendition will give you a hint of what the file can be. So I'd say to people, shoot raw plus medium JPEG, and then the JPEG will give you the vision, the raw will give you the file, and you can then work the raw file towards that JPEG vision. This is what my the back screen of my D800, the way I've got it set up, showed me.
Brilliant.
It gave me a sense of that, and then the raw file looks a blur. But I knew what I wanted, had it in my mind, had it as a, if you like, a little catalogue card in the form of a JPEG, and then it was a case of taking raw. Post-production is absolutely critical. I realise I haven't answered the question. And, you know, you can't play at the Royal Albert till you know how to play the piano.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So, like ourselves, I know that you're a huge fan of the On1 Suite 8. So, is that primarily what you're using to finish your photography with now?
More and more. I think the thing, there is a perception, certainly out in New Zealand, that perfect suite. Suite 8 is you know, On1's answer to NIC. The NIC suite. I do use the NIC suite. I've got a whole bunch of other clever little techniques that I use more and more into lab color, but for getting there, Suite 8, I'm not sure how many of your readers have realized this is actually a complete solution in itself. You can go from raw to finished work now within the suite. So I'm using it more and more. I particularly use effects, a little bit of enhance. The black and white is really, really easy, and I'm using resize. I print my own work on a Canon 6300 large format, and I've finished the work in resize, so I get the best possible file for the printer.
Oh, that's brilliant. For anybody, if you're not familiar with us, we're huge, like Tony, On1 fans. But if you head to the likes of Tony's blog, which you can find via his website, there's links there through to On1, so you can find out more about their suite and what they have to offer, and I strongly recommend that. So hopefully what you're seeing now are the links to find out more about Tony and how to get in touch with Tony. Tony, just tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've got going on. Our audience isn't just in the UK. I know I, for one, will definitely be looking for my passport and hoping to come and see you very soon. But you do organise workshops and groups. So tell us a little bit what they can get from you and how to find you and how to get information from you.
Okay, I've got 1 or 2 students who I'm mentoring. It can work globally. I sit with them, talk with their work, and help them to find their own path. But one of the things I love doing is getting out in the New Zealand landscape, and because off-roading, if you like, is a particular passion, and I've done books on off-roading, and I do a little teaching of off-roading, it's allowed me to go to places that the tourists will never see. And I occasionally stood on the side of a hill going, you guys should be there, as this little camper van, like a little beetle way below me, sort of ticking past, going, well, if only you could see this. In the last couple of years, I've had people coming to me and saying, what about an off-road tour? We'd love to go off-road and have a bit of an adventure. We'd like to do some driving. Will you take us somewhere where we can make great photographs? And I do organise bespoke tours. So if you're thinking of coming down here, or you're interested, or you've got a couple of mates and you think, well, that would be really cool to do, seeing a part of the country that nobody else does, and you want to come down, I can certainly lead you through some very interesting spots, some of which can be interestingly challenging too.
Nice. And that's the best way to get in touch with you is via your website, is that right?
Yeah, via website, or drop me an email. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and I'm on G+ as well.
You can find all the links to get in touch with Tony. You can find on our Facebook page. I've already posted them there tonight. But Tony's website there, thisistonybridge.com, where you'll also find his blog, and you can read his.
Can I just say one last thing?
Absolutely.
I noticed there's been a few sign-ups for my blog newsletter, and I've just been looking at them all, a lot of them from the UK and Ireland. So if you're listening to me now, a big thank you for joining the community. I'm posting most weeks. You never know what you're going to get. It could be a review, one of my poetic posts, or some tips and tricks. So love it if you're interested, just to sign up. Once a week it'll send you an update on what's been on the blog, if there's been something new put up there. But please, if you do visit it and you feel, love it when people make feedback. Even if you think the work is complete crap, I'd love you to say that too. At least you're saying something. I may not agree, but I'd love lots of people to become involved. Yeah, so thanks, Jay, and thank you to all of you who are still listening, and those that haven't gone to sleep.
Oh, you're very welcome, and I promise you they haven't gone to sleep. And just to reiterate, I've had some already fantastic feedback. I'm completely inspired. Thank you so much. Fantastic webinar. Loving what I'm seeing. Just to read you about a few, like Jay, I'm going to find my passport, and we'll be in touch. So loving what we saw, and loving your way that you teach it as well. So thank you from me for that. And just to reiterate that the links are available from our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Photographer Academy. So all of links to Tony's information and his sites and social media are available there now. Feel free to contact me if you need anything else from me, and I will put you in touch with Tony. So again, Tony, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know we ran over, but I have no problem with that. I loved every minute of it, and hope that maybe you'll think about doing it again for us, and hopefully maybe I'll persuade Mark to let me come out there and spend some time with you, and I'll bring the video, and then we can do some maybe video tutorial with you as well. Actually, I'm going to work on that as of tomorrow, and if Mark is listening, you know that's going to happen, pal. So I will be there. Chances are he'll want to come too, but I'm sure we can work something out. So I am going to call it a day there. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Pleasure. And hopefully, well, I'm going to bed. I know you're just starting your day, so thanks again for starting your day early for us. And I'll speak to you real soon. I'll be dropping you an email shortly as well, Tony. But thank you very much. So just going to stop the recording now, guys. But thank you so much. I'm Jay for the Photography Academy. Thanks again to Tony. Thank you all for staying with us.